William Randall Beard died recently. His obituary was in the Star Tribune this week. He had a variety of health issues. He died, COVID was the sort of the final straw. He was a playwright and theater critic in the Twin Cities, made a name for himself. He and I were in the same graduating class, and graduating class at Gustavus, along with Kevin Kling, whose name you've probably heard before. Those two and some others in that class stood out even then. Some of the rest of us, not so much. We just kind of stay in the background. But there was a story that was told that happened at Gustavus when we were there that Randall was involved in that I remember this week when I saw the news about his death. He was on the chapel council at Gustavus. And in one of the meetings that they had, he and Chaplain Elvey disagreed vehemently about something. And apparently it was quite loud, and the volume and heat in the room increased. And I don't know how it was resolved. I don't even know what the issue was, but it was not apparently resolved to the chaplain's satisfaction. So when the meeting adjourned, this was late afternoon or in the evening, it was dark, so everybody leaves the meeting room and then they leave the building. And he normally would have gone out and gotten his car and driven home, but instead he walked down the sidewalk and hid in the bushes along the walkway near the stairway where Randy would have to come by to go back to his dorm. And sure enough, Randy comes walking by a few moments later, makes his way down the stairway, partway down the stairway to his dorm, when this voice calls out from the non-burning shrubbery, "Randy, this is the Lord! You were wrong!" And apparently, reportedly, Randy then scrambled down the rest of the stairs to the dorm and rushed inside to avoid the wrath of God that was soon and sure to follow that voice. That was the version of the story that I heard. I never heard Randy's version of it. I thought it was hilarious too, remembering it this week. But can you imagine that there would be that kind of, not only the shenanigans, but that kind of disagreement that would bring about such a thing, that kind of heat, that sort of conflict in this bucolic little Lutheran college on the edge of the prairie in southern Minnesota, where all the women are strong and all the young men are good looking, and it's all the women, yeah, whatever it is, all the children are above average, yeah. Can you imagine that sort of conflict there? Sure you can. Because it's people, it's school, it's church. And where people are, where church is, where school is, where people are, there is disagreement, there is conflict. It is inevitable. It's bound to happen. But what it leads to, that can be determined. That's not decided. Well, there is apparently a fair amount of heat. You don't necessarily feel it in the reading today unless you listen closely. But there's some heat, some conflict in the words of Jesus in John 17. Now, as Chris said, this is a section where Jesus is praying for his disciples. It's the closing part of the farewell discourse in John's gospel that goes for 5 chapters, as I've said before. It's all set in the upper room around the Last Supper table. And this last part is called by some the high priestly prayer. Now, we're not real big on high priestly stuff in the United Methodist Church, so whatever. But what does happen often with preachers who pray, and Jesus is a preacher, prayers can become sermons. Have you ever noticed that? Yeah. Stan Hanks, I worked with Stan, and Stan was one of the longest prayers I have ever known. He could pray and just about redo his whole sermon, but he was such a lovely man. And anyway, sometimes we do that, and that's sort of what happens here. And Jesus is praying for his disciples, and he says, they are in but not of the world. I am no longer in the world, I'm coming to you. My disciples are still in the world, but they're not of the world. What's he saying? The song today, "This World Is Not My Home." I noticed that, and I started to argue with it a little bit this morning. What is John saying about the world? Well, he uses the world, the Greek word cosmos, in two different ways in his gospel. One way is to refer to the entire creation. So when he says, "And God so loved the world that God gave God's Son to the world that all might be saved." That's the use of the word world as all-inclusive, as God's whole world, everything and everyone. Today, when he says, "My disciples are in but not of the world," what he's talking about is a corrupt system of human beings who have aligned themselves, according to John, over against the purpose of God as it is spoken, seen, delivered, offered, lived in Jesus, as it's demonstrated in Jesus. So by the time that John writes his gospel at the end of the first chapter, or the end of first century, years 90, 95, somewhere in there, the dividing line between the two sides within the Jewish community is pretty well defined. And these two sides define themselves over against each other, with Jesus as the divider, as the dividing point. And when you think about it, how ironic is that? That this man who seemed to be about trying to create this, as we call it, radically inclusive community within the body of Judaism, to show Jews, his fellow Jews, this is how God's grace works. This is what God's love means when it's lived out in community. And that central open table would be the image for that. That's what Jesus was trying to create and bring people to. And what happens is he becomes the one that splits his people apart. The irony of that is rather profound. So the Christian church, the Jesus movement, is born out of conflict. Conflict, disagreement is not necessarily bad or good. It can be energy to lead to something good or not so good. The church is a good thing, and it's not the only time when conflict has given birth to something good and new that contributes something rich to the world. But in these days, it seems like when we disagree with one another, when there's conflict amongst us, we not only allow, but seem to want to allow it to push us apart. We seem to be leaning back and away from each other. And I wonder about that. And for instance, Jerry, I heard what you said and I disagree with you. And I don't like the way you said it, and I really don't like the tone of voice in which you said it, and I'm not sure I like you. I think you're bad. I think you're my enemy. Do you know how that works? Have you seen that in action? And we do that. There's this strange, perverse pleasure, I guess, in having enemies and naming them and keeping them out there, pushing them away. And there are groups in the world, in our country, in our state, who grow strong on the energy of that demonization of the other, distancing, naming the other as bad, as evil, as wrong. The proliferation and growth of hate groups in this country during the last 10 years is phenomenal. And they have grown in numbers and in strength on the value of that hatred of the other, whoever that is. They are strong. They're not healthy. And they don't bring health to the rest of us, but they sure wake us up. So, my followers are not of this world, Jesus says. They're not of this system, this corrupt system. They're not of this system that has declared God to be enemy. But Jesus still prays for them. Says, protect them, that they can be one as we are one. Wasn't that oneness inclusive of all the longing that Jesus had at the beginning? Isn't that what fuels his ministry, his words? Isn't that what he is about? That, in a sense, recovering our central oneness with our Creator. We all come from God. And Jesus is calling us to awaken to that and to live into that. So, is this the point where he has given up on that? Or has John given up on that, given the heat and the struggle that his community is experiencing? Have we given up on that in our own time, given what's going on in our world, given the polarization that we experience? I learned something this week. I think I do probably every week, but this was noteworthy, and it wasn't something I was looking for. I learned that the most decorated military unit in the entire history of the United States of America was called the 442nd Army Combat Team, or unit, that served in Europe in World War II. They served in Italy, is where they landed, and went through southern France and then moved on into Germany, so they were in the thick of things. One of their operations is sort of legendary. They rescued what was called the Lost Battalion. There was a unit of soldiers, mostly I think from Texas, if I remember that right, who became surrounded by German soldiers and were behind enemy lines, and they were going to be swallowed up. And they were considered lost, that there was no way to get to them. The 442nd fought through and liberated them, saved them, if you will, taking huge casualties in the process. It was a nightmare campaign. It's estimated that there were 18,000 men that served in the 442nd through its campaign in Europe, its engagement in Europe. And I said they were the most decorated, given their size and length of service, of any unit in all of American history. 18,000 men, they were awarded, amongst other things, 9,300 Purple Hearts. Just think of that. That's just part of what they were awarded. They were phenomenal. But the most remarkable thing about them was that they were a segregated unit made up entirely of second-generation Japanese American men. Many of them coming from families who were incarcerated at the time of their service in Europe. Now, you may know that after Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese, the government decided that Japanese Americans were at least potential enemies, and so they were all rounded up, as many as could be, removed to internment camps, prison camps, concentration camps in the western part of the United States. And they lost everything at that. One member of the 442nd, I think it was Henry Uno, was the one, went to visit his family in Crystal City Camp in Texas before he was deployed to Europe. He said it was like going to visit people in prison. There were armed guards making sure that we kept our distance, that we didn't pass anything. There was no physical contact allowed. We were treated like criminals because we were Japanese Americans. We had done nothing wrong, but we were treated as though we were. And he said we could do nothing about it. We just had to take it. It was what we had to do. Be good, patriotic Americans and serve our country even though we were hated before and after we did so. And it's true. They were honored, highly honored by the military and honored by President Truman, but they were despised by many of their white fellow citizens in this country, even after they came back, even after thousands of them gave their lives for this country. It wasn't until 1988 that President Ronald Reagan signed a formal apology and a reparations bill that would give them back some of what they lost, a small portion. Over 40 years it took. And we know that there are other groups who have been locked up and locked out for centuries in this country, and we talk about reparations for them. That's another subject altogether, along with the apologies that are in order. But we have right there conflict, demonization, imprisonment, othering, declaring people who are in our midst to be our enemies, incarcerating them, and despising them. And their struggle to prove that they are not our enemy, that they are us, and what the cost was, and still couldn't prove it, still couldn't get it through. So, do you know what's been happening lately? Some of the children, those Japanese American children who were incarcerated in those camps during World War II, have been gathering with their families and others on the border of the United States and Mexico in response to the policies and practices of this country and how Central Americans coming here for safety and for a better life, how they are being treated. These former enemies, incarcerated enemies, are standing up on behalf of the recently declared enemies, the rapists, murderers, drug dealers who are coming here to take over. We're coming here for a better life, as migrants have done since humans began on this earth, migrating to places for better life. That's how we ended up here, you and I. Our ancestors came here for a better life. So our problem with migrants is our own problem, and we need to deal with that here. But those who were once living behind barbed wire as children are saying, no more children in cages. And there was a man holding up a sign, this Japanese-American man who was a child in the camp, holding up a sign that said, "We have been here before. No more. No more." My followers are in but not of this world, Jesus says. They are not part of this ugly system that demonizes and builds walls and draws lines and pushes people out and hates them and calls them the enemy and incarcerates them. Yet, those same followers of Jesus can fall prey to that sort of behavior and attitude. And we do sometimes. We sometimes declare who the enemies are of us. We participate in that, and we sometimes elect leaders who gain power from that hatred and make us all sicker as a result of it. So protect them, Jesus prays. Protect us so that we might all be one as we are. Protect us from our own scared, small, dark side. Protect us from our prejudices and our biases and our tendencies to hate the other. Awaken us to those things. Keep us awake to those things so that we never rest or go to sleep until we find our way. Find your way, God, beneath the lines we draw on your world. Behind the labels we stamp on your children, beyond the gated neighborhoods of smothering sameness that kill the spirit, into the place where we all belong. Into the place where we all belong. Into the place where we all belong. Where we all belong. Amen.